Welcome back to the Athlete's Edge podcast. On today's episode, we're sort of going to, build off last week where we touched on how sport has the ability to break kids down, especially when they're doing too much. So we're going to go behind the curtain and, discuss, our sort of approach. We've got our sort of 2-day, 3-day and 5-day program sort of up on the whiteboard there. So can you sort of walk us through, the differences between each and what, each sort of different membership kind of looks like?
Yep. So all three have a very speed-based approach. So obviously that included access to our speed sessions in the past. At the moment we have our prep sort of warm-up block and we do our speed block that everyone does before we head up and do our lifts. That even our lifts are designed to support speed on the field or court or in the pool and aren't just about, bodybuilding or powerlifting and stuff that we've discussed before. So that's a similar theme across all three programs. Where they differ is obviously the number of sessions per week, which means some have things included or removed just due to the time constraints and the contact hours. So obviously in our 2-day program, we've really just prioritised our sort of speed and the gym component of that. So it's 2 sessions where we do an acceleration day and a max velocity day. Which obviously acceleration, a bit more of the horizontal stuff, a bit more of the force-based stuff, whereas the max velocity day, more around our upright type movements and our reactive strength and being elastic and really quick on the ground, for example. Our 3-day program, similar in that it has the excel and the max velocity day, but it has that compulsory Monday at the start of the week, which is really valuable because the athletes that typically go in this 3-day program, that Monday is very much that regeneration, rebuild day where we put a lot of our our joint health exercises in there and our tendon health and some extra rotator cuff work for the shoulder. So it's got a real sort of rebuild and injury prevention focus that's really important for the sort of typically the age that these kids are at and the sports they're playing. And in that program we actually have 3 different programs within it running depending on field, court or water sports and with a couple of levels across each. And then we've got our 5-day program, which again has our acceleration and max velocity days with a little bit of sort of scale there. Obviously these kids are typically a little bit older and more experienced. They've also got a regen injury prevention day where they include a little bit more of that upper body strength on the Monday. Midweek they've got an upper body strength day. And then later in the week they've got what we call the Friday power session, which doubles as sort of extra sort of high end, more advanced strength power work, doubles up as a bit of a primer for the weekend. So they're typically our more higher level athletes, which I think we've designed it so that we've got entry level kind of programming, young age, and we can talk about who it's for exactly, all the way through to guys that maybe are playing at a high level and obviously are knocking on the door of hopefully some professional level sport.
So obviously there's a pretty big speed focus that sort of underpins everything that we do.
Yep.
Obviously with the sort of 5-day, you've got a bit more, freedom in terms of what you can do. How does that sort of look different? You kind of touched on it with the court, field and water-based athletes. How does it sort of look different compared to each of those?
Yep. Within the 3-day program?
Yeah. Yep. Oh, well, within all of it, really.
Yep. So our 2-day program, our speed block and our gym, essentially everyone does the same speed work. Like I said, it's acceleration and max velocity focused. And then we'll have 2 levels to our gym-based stuff. And a lot of that is, yes, some general strength work, yes, some general power work, but still lots of coordinative work, some really specific strength work, like our calf and ankle strength, for example, or our hamstring and hip extension work, which a lot of the kids really struggle with. So typically these are younger ages, so we do a lot of work in and around that. And because it's typically younger ages, even our level 2 will be more of an introduction to some of the more like barbell type movements and stuff like that. Level 3, our 3-day program, we're expecting athletes to be at a bit more of a higher level. They're typically a bit more sort of switched on, more experienced with their training. So that's where we'll have a field, court and water sport. So the differences there, field sort of still focusing more on the like acceleration day probably doesn't differ too much, but where we get to the max velocity day, obviously it's not as important for court athletes, so they're going to do a bit more around that deceleration and change of direction work, particularly in the gym stuff, to help build the physical capacity so they can do it better on the court. And then the water sports obviously need change of direction and stuff less typically. So they do some extra stuff in and around, like hip work for their swimming kick, like extension, for our water polo athletes. Obviously hip mobility is really important, and they'll do a bit more extra upper body type work, given obviously they're pulling themselves through the water. And then they'll have a couple of levels within that. So obviously more the body weight and med ball banded exercises at level 1, and getting into a bit more of your barbell lifts at times with the level 2s. And then the 5 days, a bit of more of a mixed bag, because like you said, we've got so much more contact. We're essentially seeing them for close to 5 hours a week instead of 2 or 3 hours. We get to do a lot more of the coordinative stuff. They're typically at a pretty good strength level, so chasing more strength all the time actually doesn't help them at all. Because like study on sprinting speed showing that you can sprint at a pretty high level if you squat half your body weight versus 2 times your body weight. It's not strength that's the limiting factor. It helps to a degree, but it's how you apply that force or use that strength. So that's where they'll do things like more rotation work, more use the aqua bags a bit. They're doing a bit more of those funny type exercises, but there's a real purpose to how we build, core control, pelvic stability, because we see them more, we get to know them better as a result, and it allows us to be a bit more specific with some of the programming and the coaching.
And so who are we kind of targeting? What demographics are we sort of looking at for each of the programs there?
Yep. So typically the 2-day program I think works best for that 12 to 13 sort of entry age for us, up to maybe 14, 15. And that's mainly because at that age we still are encouraging playing multiple sports, so potentially 2 or 3 sports, although we shouldn't be overlapping at this point too much in a season, and definitely not on the same day. So if they are overlapping a little bit, hence why it's only 2 sessions, because we don't want to just overload with more training. And because of this age, we were discussing before around things like recovery, nutrition. They're learning a lot of this stuff at school and seeing it on social media and from coaches, but they haven't probably got all this dialed in yet. Therefore, if we're adding more load to already pretty stressful sports schedules while they're going through growth spurts and they haven't figured out recovery and nutrition and these sort of things yet, we don't want to obviously break them down, burn them out before they sort of reach that post peak growth period. So that's where we recommend that age sort of 2 sessions. We're starting to get to that 3 session for maybe some 13-year-olds at some point, but like 14 sort of through to that 16, 17. And that's because at that age, they're probably playing sport, especially if they're playing in a good competition. It's pretty demanding. So that Monday session that we spoke about becomes really important to set up their week. This is where I really sort of reinforce that they're learning how to train properly. So the 3 sessions makes them get a bit more organised. They've got to start to look after themselves a bit better. They've got to start to juggle how this fits in around all their other sport training and school and everything else. So they're really learning about what it takes to be an athlete. And it's a bit of a make or break period, and that's what we're there for. It's some of the chats I enjoy the most around how do we make all this work. And then around that sort of 15 but 16 plus is when that 5-day program I think becomes a great option, and it's moving from I'm learning how to train to I've got that pretty dialed in. I'm now ready for an extra couple of sessions a week. Now I want to really compete, learn to compete at a high level. So now and into their next phase of whatever their sporting journey brings, and the feedback we often get is that even guys and girls that go on to AFLs and college sports and stuff go in almost more prepared than some of the players that have already been in the system for 2 or 3 years.
And so to sort of finish off, we obviously had the Carlton AFLW team sort of come in this week and use the facility. So yeah, what were your sort of key takeaways from that?
Yeah, my probably my biggest takeaway is it shows, like, because they were brilliant, the girls were so switched on, and that's very much that learning to compete training sort of approach now. They're not asking questions like, what do I do? It's more, how do I maximise this? So it goes from what questions to very much how, which it sounds like a small fine detail, but when you see it, it is just like worlds apart. So they were great. The staff were great. Just, really professional, really diligent. But what I think, we had a few of our girls, AFL girls in there, and I think they took a lot of confidence from it, because what they saw was they're actually at that level from a training perspective. So when you learn to compete, the lesson there is, like, and these girls have been with us for a while, and they're really switched on young athletes. It's now about how I do this consistently, because you know how to do it. Now it's about, how do I maximise every session? How do I get that 1% out of every exercise, every day, morning and night, week on week, over 2, 3, 5, 10 years? And I think that's the difference. So that's why we have our phases 2-day, juggling sport, trying to introduce some training. They're getting new to it, understanding the gym, doing some speed work. Yes, getting faster, understanding it's a bit of a slow burn because they're doing so much. As they work their way through, a bit more specialised, sport starts to drop back a bit, funny enough, because they start to select a bit more targeted around what sport they do, how many training sessions they do. So now they're starting to really work on strengths and weaknesses. And obviously on the 5-day, they're pretty locked in. They know where they want to be. They've got a clear goal. I want to be at this level. I want to go here. This is what I want to achieve. So now it's locked in and trying to achieve it.